Sorry about that. Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are myself, Andrea Schweitzer, and Althea Wheeler will be presenting today on Thesis Practicum Deposit, what you need to know. Few housekeeping, we are recording. We will be avoiding using names at all possible. If you, we'll be providing the link to the recording on the Thesis and Deposit help page, which I'll show in a minute. If you have any questions, please use the Word document that's available in the Word document. And if you can't access the Word document, you can please put your questions in the chat. There's quite a few of you today, and so we're delighted that you are here, and we're going to try our best to answer everyone's questions. If we can't, please reach out to us after by email, or you can reach out to us on Teams, and Althea and I are happy to answer your questions. So with that, we're going to get started. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward and in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Today, we're going to start with a live walkthrough of the new MSpace platform. We're going to then proceed to discuss copyright for Thesis and Practicum Deposit, and take the opportunity to show some new tools that are available to you. We're also going to talk about publishing decisions and Thesis Deposit. And because the link list is very popular, we are going to repeat the offer of the link slide. I should say that the slide deck will be available with the actual video recording afterwards. So if you want to have access to that link list, it will be available to you. And we'll just discuss the outline of Thesis Deposit, just for some clarity between how Faculty of Graduate Studies and the libraries sort of interact. And then we'll proceed to the question and answer period. So here is the link list. I think a lot of times people aren't necessarily aware that these links exist. There is quite a lot of information on them. They are very good information to know. So I really encourage you after this presentation to have a look at this list. And if you're not familiar with them, click through them and have a look. So I've broken these up into sort of three categories that we're largely going to be talking about today. So a lot of questions that I get pertain to sort of like the thesis and practicum procedures. So those are largely outlined on the graduate studies link here. If you're not aware of your student program assistant, please make yourself familiar with them. They are the ones that approve the thesis. So once you deposit, it is not the libraries that review and provide feedback. It is your student program assistant. So if you're not aware of who those people are, I would encourage you to click on that link and look them up. The library side of things is providing some assistance in terms of metadata, considerations around publishing, pre and post thesis, as well as how to use the repository platform that is MSpace. So that information is found in those two links. And then the third section here is previously published, and we're going to be going over, or at least touching on, some of these aspects. Althea will be going into some great detail, and she's provided a lot of great information here on copyright and thesis practicum, so really encourage you to have a look at that. A lot of questions I get regards to open access and rights to deposit, or rights to publish after deposit. So all of those questions are usually in those two sections around open access and author rights. So on that note, we are going to proceed to show you how to log into MSpace and then walk you through how to add material, orientation to the input form with the new license agreement, and the overview of the thesis deposit workflow. So I'm just going to exit out of the presentation at this point. And I am going to open this browser screen. So when you go to mspace.lib.umanitoba.ca/home, or just mspace.lib.umanitoba.ca, you will, this is the front page now. So if you have looked at MSpace in the past, it looks a little different. And how you log in looks a little different. It is up on the top right. You will click login and you will use your U of M email address. So some version of your name at myumanitoba.ca, and then your password, and then you click login. So once you are logged in, it will look like this. You will click the little person, you will see your name, and then you will see profile, you see my MSpace, and then you see subscriptions. To deposit, you click my MSpace. So your default view is your submissions, and that's what you are seeing here. If you have already created a submission, you will see that indicated in this list here. To then initiate a deposit, you can do it many different ways. So the first way that you can do it, and I'm just going to minimize this just to show. Of course, I buried my 10 material over there, is to take your thesis and drag and drop it in anywhere in the page, actually. So you drag and drop it, and then you proceed to click to scroll through here, looking for the Faculty of Graduate Studies. Now, the reason why you're seeing so many options here is because I am logged in as an administrator on MSpace. So you will only see two options for you. You will see the Faculty of Graduate Studies, or you'll see the University of Manitoba Scholarly Works. So once you find the Faculty of Graduate Studies, you click that option, and then you will proceed into the input form. If for whatever reason drag and drop doesn't work for you, you can click Browse. And you click your file. And then again, you will find the Faculty of Graduate Studies. Not that one, this one. Faculty of Graduate Studies, Electronic Thesis and Practicum. The other option is to select this here and click item. You then select your faculty, which is Faculty of Graduate Studies. down. Trust me, it's not going to take as long as that this is taking me. And then you will then proceed to come here to the input page, and then you can proceed to either drag and drop or use the browse feature. Okay. So in other words, there are many different ways to initiate a deposit. If you're not clear about what those ways are, I'm happy to sort of take you to after we walk through the input form to show you sort of the textual walkthrough that is available to you on the MSpace help pages. Okay, so now we are in the input form of your thesis deposit. Okay, and you know you're in the right collection because it says Thesis, Electronic Thesis of Practicum. Okay, so the first step is to enter your name. So the easiest way to do that is to put in your last name. And then if you wish, you can proceed to search your name in MSpace. A few things about this. If you've created an ORCID ID, and you wish to have the ORCID attached to this deposit, you can click search. And you can look for your name in this list. Depending on your name, it may be easier or difficult to find. If you have deposited previously in MSpace, you will find your name twice. Please look for both MSpace as well as ORCID in the record. So if you can scroll down here, so this is me, this is my ORCID record. And so I could select that, but I also know that I have both ORCID and MSpace in the database. I'm just scrolling down. Okay, so I am going to go find my name up here. If you do not feel comfortable doing this, just click. You don't have to click search. It does help us, though, to reconcile you in MSpace if you have more than one entry. You will then put in today's date, likely. If you want, after you enter the dates, if they're not correct, you can use the arrow keys to toggle back and forth. At this point, you can enter in the title of your thesis. If your thesis happens to be in another language, you can put that language in the title field and then put the English equivalent in the other titles. So for example, if you've written your thesis in French, you put in the French title. Sorry, the French version of that title in title, and then you will put the English equivalent in the other titles. And you can put additional other titles as you wish. You then type in your abstract or copy and paste your abstract more likely. And then when you get to Manitoba related content, if your thesis is particular to anything pertaining to the province of Manitoba, so specific to Winnipeg or any kind of community within Manitoba, or anything related to that, you can indicate that yes, it is related to Manitoba. But if it isn't, then you can select no. In terms of subject keywords, a lot of people ask have some questions about this. My recommendation is that the abstract does provide a pretty good discoverability, as with the title, but subject keywords is words that it gives you the opportunity to put alternative words that also describe your content that is not necessarily contained in your abstract. So not necessarily acronyms, but if you have phrases or other kinds of descriptors that describe like the key concepts in your thesis that's not necessarily in your abstract, that's the opportunity to put it in there. So for example, I'm trying to think of an example. And all the examples I'm coming up with are medical, but so if you said had like a flat, let's say, I was just looking at something with pathogens yesterday. So if you had if you just were talking about pathogens in the general, but then your thesis had particular pathogens that were specified, but not necessarily in your abstract, those would be, for an example, what you would want to put in there. So specifying the actual pathogens as keywords. So let's put the test for now. And if you want to add more keywords, you can put them in there. If you want to change the order of them, you can just drag and drop like that. Okay, in terms of language, indicate the language of your thesis. If it is multilingual, select multiple languages. If it is in a language not in this list, please select other. So this is the first section of the input form, sort of what we call the general information description. So this input form can be collapsed. Each section can be collapsed or expanded as you wish. So for the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to collapse this first section and then proceed to the next section. You will select your degree of your thesis. So I'm just going to pick MA for something, and then you will pick your corresponding program of study. The graduation date, this is corresponding to the deadlines as determined by the Faculty of Graduate Studies. So in this case, most of these dates have passed. So the most date that would be relevant to this presentation would be October 2023. And then at this point, what you would do is put in your supervisors. So if you have more than one supervisor, you click add more. And again, just like the subject heading option, you can change up the order if you wish. With the examining committee members, please follow the convention listed down here. So this is, I'll just use the example as listed. So and then if you have, for every additional member, just click more and then next name and next affiliation. it's an external one, please put, for example, University of Winnipeg in the brackets. If you wish to change the order, you can change it. For every entry like this, you'll see sort of the little trash can. So if you need to delete it and change it, you can do all of that. So I'm just gonna, so for example, there, if you have an invited member, you would put their name there, and as indicated, you would put their affiliation in parentheses beside the name. Okay. So funders. So a lot of people get hung up about this funder section. This funding information is just sort of additional information to provide some indication if people are looking for reports on, say, who is the major funder for like this, you know, for theses in this department. That's kind of where we're getting at here. So if you receive funding for your thesis, put your funder name here. If you happen to know the identifier, please put it here. A lot of Canadian funders, unfortunately, do not have funder identifiers. So I'm happy to aid in that if you wish. Please don't get hung up about this. A lot of students get really worried or like, I don't really understand how this works or whatever. You don't have to put the funding information. If you have received tri-agency funding, this would be recommended to fill out. If you haven't, then I wouldn't worry about this section. Okay. At this point, we're at the upload files section. So please pay attention to this section in particular. You do not have to change the file name of your thesis, but I would strongly recommend it. And to do that is to go into the little pencil with the page, click it, and then you can type thesis here. Now, if you have received permission from the Faculty of Graduate Studies to apply an embargo, this is where you would want to describe why there's an embargo applied to your thesis. Then you will select embargo from the access condition type, and then you will state when the embargo is released, i.e. when the date from which you are permitting public access to your thesis. I recommend using the calendar here to help you identify the date. A lot of people have a lot of questions about this. Althea and I will be getting back to this as we discuss copyright and publication choices. And we'll talk a little bit more about at that point in our presentation about, you know, what are embargoes, why embargoes, and how do you get permission to apply an embargo. But this in the input form is where you put the embargo. So I'm going to say something like, okay, so 12-month publication delay from today's date or whenever the date of publication would be. So I would change it to 2024, and if it's a 12-month and let's say it's from today, then I would put it for July 2024, the day being the 12th, and then I clicked save. Okay. So you can see here that the description for your for the actual material now displays. And you can see that the embargo date is clearly indicated. The final step in inputting submitting your thesis is the license. Please read this carefully. So I'm just going to read this aloud, and then I'm going to click the link here. So by clicking the checkbox in the deposit license section of this form, you affirm that you have read and agreed to the terms of the MSpace copyright distribution license, and that this license shall be binding on you. You will read the linked document carefully. By clicking the checkbox, you are granting rights to the University of Manitoba and making representations and warranties about the material in your submission. If you have any questions about this license, please contact the Copyright Office, that's Althea, at um.copyright@umanitoba.ca for assistance. Okay, so please read the copyright distribution license. So that will take you to this PDF right here. Please read this through. When you click that you agree to the license, we assume that you have read this. So I'm not going to take the time at this presentation to sort of walk through this. Althea can talk to it if as she wishes in this presentation. However, we will say that there's a great deal of confusion in depositing thesis. A lot of people seem to feel that, or at least they think that they have somehow transferred copyright to the University of Manitoba with this action. In fact, you do not. You retain your copyright to your thesis. So you have all rights to reproduce your thesis in any way, shape, or form that you wish. All you're doing in this license, and as I say, Althea can go into this in more detail, you're just affirming that you have rights to deposit the material you're depositing to MSpace. And that you're taking on the understanding that if you're in violation of those in any way, then it's your responsibility. So if you are agreeing to that, you click I confirm that I have read this. And then if you are prepared at this time to deposit, you click the green button. If you are not, you can click save for later. And what happens is it goes into my submissions. So I'm just going to save it into my submissions. So I'm just waiting for it so I can show it to you. If it gets hung up like that, just hit your refresh or reload function, as you saw me do there, and then just take the action that I did, and then you'll see that will sort of go. So because I have quite a long list of submissions, for you, it'll be like right there at the top. But here's the submission that I worked on today. So if I wished to go back into it, I would click edit, or I could click view and then edit. And then once I was okay with each one of these sections, I would then click deposit. So I'm not going to click deposit at this point. But once you do, you will get a screen that confirms that you have deposited. You will not get an email. Now then, what happens at this point is that it has entered the workflow of the Faculty of Graduate Studies Student Program Assistant. Your respective student program assistant will then review your deposit when they get to it in their task list, and then any response that you may receive is actually from them. Okay. So at this point, I am going to go back to the presentation and resume our PowerPoint. And as I said, if there's any questions about that process, we're happy to take it up in the questions section. Okay, it's over to Althea. Althea, did you want me to click through?
Or if you wouldn't mind, I think at the end I might, if you don't mind, screen share just to show the copyright course. But other than that, yeah, that would be great. I noticed we have some hands up now. Do we want that in, if possible, in the chat or in the Word document if there are any questions right now?
In the Word document or in the chat, preferably Word document if possible.
Okay, great. So as you can see, I'm Althea Wheeler. I'm the Copyright Strategy Manager at the University of Manitoba. If you have any copyright questions, please always feel free to contact me. That's what I'm here for, to help you with those. Little note, copyright is a legal subject, but this presentation is for informational purposes, shouldn't be taken as legal advice, but it is to help provide you some guidance while you're making copyright choices. If you go to the next slide, that would be great. So as Andrea was telling you, students, you will generally own the copyright in your thesis or practicum. That's almost in all cases. I put a little caveat here because sometimes we do see situations where, for example, there's co-authors. Perhaps, you know, you've written your thesis, but it's part of a publication. There are co-authors. Co-authors jointly own copyright in something, so they might have some sort of interest or the ability to say things about, you know, how they want that material to be used. So that's important to think about if your thesis does consist of any co-authored material. And I also note here that employment can affect copyright ownership. Sometimes if someone has created a thesis and part of it has been an employment expectation, so maybe you've written something as part of your employment at UM or somewhere else, and that's gone in your thesis, again, an employer might have a copyright issue or interest, I should say, because typically when we write something within the course of employment, employers own the copyright. There are some exceptions to that. Even at the university, there are some exceptions, but I just bring this up just so, you know, you're thinking to yourself, I own the copyright in my thesis, but there might be a couple of things that could have an impact on it. But since you will generally own the copyright in your thesis, as Andrea was saying, you don't ever need to ask the university for permission for anything. It is yours. You're able to decide what you do with it. Go forward. Slide. Thank you. However, and now you've seen that license and declaration, so you know exactly where this is all coming into it. But when you do upload your thesis to MSpace, you will have to check that box, read that license and declaration, and legally declare that you have ensured that your thesis is or practicum is copyright compliant. And you do this for a couple of reasons. One is that we are going to be making it publicly available. You're giving in that license permission to the university to make your thesis publicly available for the expansion of scholarship across Canada and the world, and also for us to allow other information aggregators or other library services like Library and Archives Canada to also make your thesis publicly available. So that's one thing that the license does. But we also have a declaration. We need to make sure that everything within the thesis or practicum is copyright compliant. And to do that, we need to think, are you reusing anything that you did not create? And that could include things like images or figures from other published articles or manuscripts. If you're reusing that sort of material, you need to think, how can I do this? On what copyright basis do I need permission? And you also want to think about your own work because sometimes it's wonderful we've gotten published, but we need to remember if we have published something or something's pending publication, or you even intend to publish it, we want to be thinking about your own work and whether there are any copyright considerations in that before we make it publicly available through MSpace. So go to the next slide, please. So when do we need to think about copyright, especially if you're thinking of reusing materials? Almost all of the time, generally. So unless the creator is deceased in 1971 or earlier, because copyright doesn't exist forever. It does end 70 years after the year of death of the creator. And you might think, why have I said that 1971 date? And that's because this is a recent change. It used to be 50 years. It's going to be 70 years, but the 70 years doesn't really kick in until we get to 2043. So right now our operative date is 1971. So it's kind of easy to remember, but if it was the creator was dead in 1971 or earlier, their work may be part of the public domain. And that could be many kinds of work: literary, dramatic, cinematographic. That's our copyright word for film or video. But if it's newer than that, the creator hasn't passed away yet, it's going to have copyright protection. So we do need to think, what is the basis upon which we can reuse that material? But when I say that, copyright law does not apply to insubstantial amounts of a work. So basically, if you're taking an insubstantial amount of a work, you don't even need to think about copyright, really. The Copyright Board has suggested in some circumstances 1% to 2%. So when people say, well, I want to quote from a work, can I do that? I say usually yes. That's going to be insubstantial. It won't even be a copyright consideration. But of course, we need to make sure we have appropriate citation and attribution as to meet all of our academic integrity obligations. So usually not a copyright consideration, but we still need to think about our citations, etc. And the other thing copyright law does not prevent you from doing is paraphrasing. Copyright law does not protect ideas, facts, concepts. It protects the expression of those facts, ideas, or concepts. So the way something is written, the way something is in a fixed format, so recorded, for example, or in a file, written on a piece of paper, that writing, the way it's expressed, has copyright protection, not necessarily the ideas contained therein. So that's why we can have situations where, for example, maybe two students are working on theses that are on similar concepts or topics. If we've taken ideas from someone else, we need to attribute them. That's part of not plagiarizing and our academic integrity, but it's not really a copyright issue if you've paraphrased and rephrased something someone else said, as long as you give them their credit. We can go to the next slide, thanks. So as a copyright user, if you are thinking of using materials that someone else created in your thesis, we need to consider a few things. One is who owns the copyright, and that might seem obvious. You might think it's going to be the author or creator, and while that's the case in most cases, copyright can be transferred, and very classically, a lot of publication agreements will have a copyright transfer, which means the publisher may be the one who can provide copyright permission. As I noted with thesis or materials that you are producing, copyright can be jointly owned. So sometimes we have more than one person who needs to be consulted if they're getting permission for reuse of material. Copyright exists after someone passes away, so it can be inherited. Sometimes an heir might be the right person. Or, as I said, sometimes copyright is owned by an employer. The other thing when you're reusing materials, we want to think, is there anything that allows us automatically to reuse the material? And that's something like an open license. You may have heard of Creative Commons licenses. These are basically legal licenses that say to the world that anyone may reuse this material. The author is endorsing that, they want them to, but there's going to be a series of conditions upon doing that. We may need to get permission, and I'll talk about how you can get permission if you need to do that to put something in your thesis. Then we might think about copyright exceptions. Fair dealing is sort of the key one when it comes to theses and whether or not we might be able to reuse someone else's material without having to get their permission. And then there are also something called moral rights. These are rights of the reputation of a creator, and we do need to think about them when we are reusing someone else's work. We can go to the next slide, thank you. So Creative Commons licenses. These are, I think, wonderful tools when we're thinking about material that we can reuse freely in a thesis. Creative Commons is an organization that's created a series of legal licenses. So they're things that creators can put on their work to tell the world how they can reuse the work. You don't have to go ask for permission because it's automatically granted as long as you follow the terms of the license. You might be seeing these more and more, especially on academic works, open educational resources, open access. They're becoming very common. You may even be thinking of using them on your work. And just as an example, if you were thinking of reusing an image, here we have an image of a bird. You can see underneath it, it says some rights reserved, and I see some symbols, and those are Creative Commons icons. So when I click, yeah, exactly there. When I click, these licenses should always have a link back to the text of the license. And I'm going to go to the website, which you'll see the reproduction of here, that's going to tell us exactly what we can do. And they're very user-friendly, very easy to use, because it says here, I'm free to share, and here are some terms. One is attribution, and that's really important. That's going to be something with all Creative Commons licenses. I can only reuse this non-commercially, and no derivatives means I can't make any modifications or changes. As long as I follow those conditions, I am free to reuse this material. So that's a great thing to know we can do in something like a thesis. Go to the next slide, please. So as I was mentioning, attribution, big thing with Creative Commons licenses. Always good to go back, read the license so you know exactly what you can do. As I say, there should be a link there, but attribution is basically always going to be required. You can find out more about best practices for attribution at this link to the library's open scholarship page. But basically, best practices for attribution are probably what you'd expect with what you know about citation and style guides. We need to make sure we have the title of a work, who the author or creator is. We want to attribute them, a source. And Creative Commons really likes to suggest, if it's a digital resource, link back to everything so people can see exactly where you got it from. The thing that's different with Creative Commons is we also need the license. We need to make sure that we have that in our attribution. And as you can see, hyperlinking back to the text of the license. So the idea with this is really that, you clicked that, you learned how you could reuse this material, everybody else should too. So we need to make sure we have that. And as I say, these things are free to reuse as long as we follow the terms of the license. So this is an easy way to make sure we are following those terms and we're permitted to reuse the material. I do say there is a little bit of caution with Creative Commons licenses, only in that sometimes we can find an article might have one license on it, but then sometimes images that are inserted, they could have different licenses, or they could have different copyright terms. So if you are reusing something that's an insert, I always suggest, go back, make sure, yes, I know that this is still under the license, or whether something else applies that might temper how you can reuse that material. And the other thing is, if you do find something online that you're going, I'm very surprised that this has a Creative Commons license, only a creator can apply Creative Commons licenses. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of confusion about that. So, if you see something like a New York Times bestseller and you're going, I'm really surprised this is free for me to reuse and remix and share, I would do some due diligence, check and see, maybe somebody put that online who shouldn't have. But, things like open educational resources, open access scholarship, I would expect Creative Commons licenses, and I would have no problem applying them. Just go forward for reuse of materials. So if we can move to the next slide, thanks. So let's say there's no open license, you're not sure whether or not you're allowed to reuse material. And a copyright exemption does not apply. I'm going to talk about those in just a second. But then usually we know we need to get permission. And when you're thinking of what you want to use in your thesis or practicum, it's a good idea to think about this early on, because I do sometimes have people come to me sort of, a couple weeks before they're depositing, and they go, I've reused a lot of images by a photographer or an architect or something like that. And I'm just realizing now, maybe I can't just do that. So it's a good idea to start thinking, what are you going to reuse and do you need permission? And starting early is not a bad idea, because especially if you have to contact individuals, sometimes it can take a while for them to get back to you. You might have to follow up. So again, we need to think, who is the copyright owner? Could be a publisher, an author, employer, or inheritor. As I said, that's sort of our first step. Who do we even need to ask for permission? And then we want to make a request. And as I say, you do want to make it in writing. Writing is important because, of course, if we maybe have verbal permission, people forget things. We want to make sure we have a record of that. So that's important. If you want to reuse something from an article that's available through our libraries, often there's actually a link where you can find under something like tools, it'll say request permission. Often it's at the top of underneath the title of the work. You can request permission. It will take you to a site called RightsLink from the Copyright Clearance Center. It has a drop-down menu. You input all the information about how you want to reuse the material. And typically for thesis use, that's free. So that's, especially if you're wanting to reuse things from articles, that can be a really simple way to make sure you have permission to do that. Some publishers will have a fillable form on their website where you'll fill out exactly what you want to reuse and how, and you can send that off. And with those automated processes, often it's pretty quick to get permission. We also have on the Copyright Office website a sample permission letter that you can use. You can use your own wording, but you'll provide citation information about what you're using, how you intend to use it. Very important to be clear about how you intend to use works, because our permission is only as broad as what we ask for. So for example, I sometimes say if you want to reuse something in a thesis, then later you want to publish, those could be 2 different permissions, depending on what you asked when you sent in your permission letter. So you want to think about, how am I going to use this so you can get the permission you need? But that's something that's also available to you from our office website to help you with those requests. Next slide, please. If you get permission granted, the first thing you want to do is read the license, know what it says. As I said, usually permission, especially through something like RightsLink, will be free. But if for some reason they're wanting to charge you a fee, you might want to say, actually, I don't want this permission. Perhaps you don't want to pay that fee. You're going to maybe not use that material, or think of something else you can use instead. Maybe you can negotiate the fee if they do insist on a fee. As I said, in writing is good. You don't need to have it in ink. We don't need signatures, etc. An email saying confirmation that yes, you can use this material, that will be just as good. You do want to keep a copy of permission letters for your files. The reason is you're the one who's deciding what's going in your thesis. You're asking for the permission. That's something that you want a record of go forward, because you might need to refer to it from time to time in future. You do not need to provide that permission letter to the university. As I said, that's something for your own personal records. And you don't need to put your permission letters in your thesis or practicum. And I suggest you don't do that, because sometimes they'll have personal information, and or for example, signatures, things that we don't want going on MSpace where, anyone can access them online. So keep those letters for your own records. And if for some reason you ask for permission, you're told, nope, you can't get it, you can contact me and we'll talk about whether there are other options or what you might do instead. So next slide, please. When you have gotten permission, we do recommend a used with permission statement. You can put that wherever you've cited the work or your references, etc. Sometimes copyright owners will say, I want you to use a specific statement. If they do, I'd say use it, because obviously that's a term of them giving you permission. If they don't say, here's a specific statement, you'll want to use whatever your citation style guide is, and usually put used with permission at the end. And here we have an example just to show, that's what we're saying when you want to use with permission statement. You'll also want to think about this when you have signed a copyright transfer agreement. So you've got an accepted manuscript or a preprint. Sometimes publishers will say, maybe you can use one of those versions in your thesis, but here's a statement that you need to put saying, where it originally is located, or a citation that they want you to reference, etc. Just in general, make sure you're reading your copyright agreements. If you are publishing, you need to know what the terms are and how you can or cannot reuse your materials, and what you need to do in order to, have the permission from them. If, for example, you have for copyright. So the next slide, thanks. So I mentioned, while we can get permission, sometimes we know we have automatic permission because we have a license that tells us we can reuse the material. The Copyright Act also allows us to reuse material without getting permission in certain circumstances. You may have heard of fair dealing. It's an exception in the Copyright Act that allows us to just copy and distribute an amount that is fair. Now, you may have heard of our fair dealing guidelines at the university as well. And while we do have fair dealing guidelines, they're really applicable to teaching. They're about what kind of materials can we copy for the purpose of giving to students for teaching purposes. They're not going to be directly analogous to thinking about how we can use materials in a thesis. And that's because fair dealing it's a test that comes from us from the Copyright Act. It's something that the Supreme Court has decided this is how we need to apply that test, and it's very factually specific. So we need to think about it specifically in the context of a thesis, if that's what you are reusing material for. It's a 2-step and 6-factor test that's considered on a case-by-case basis. Basically, we're thinking, is there a fair dealing purpose, which could be research, education, private study, criticism, review, parody, satire, news reporting. So obviously with a thesis, something like research might apply. And then we need to think about this test that the court has made and sort of balancing whether or not the use is fair. We think of why something, or the goal behind why something is being reused. So is it commercial, is it non-commercial? Things like non-commercial use might tip more towards being fair. We want to think about the amount and what you are taking from a work. So, taking smaller portions, only what's necessary, that's going to be something that's fair. There is some indication from the court we need to think about what part of a work. So something like maybe the conclusion might be a bit less fair than taking something from the middle of a work, for example. We need to think, are there any alternatives? Did you need to make the copy? Could you have done something else instead? Maybe provided a link, for example. Is there something else we could have done to get that information out there? What kind of work is it? Is it something publicly accessible, something confidential? You can imagine something confidential, maybe not as fair as something that's already publicly accessible. Then we need to think about the market for the work. Is your reuse of the material going to in some way harm the creator because they cannot market their work in the same way? So balancing that, we can decide whether or not something's fair to reuse. But we always have to think about the situation, what's being used, etc. And since you are doing the copying, you are deciding what will go in your thesis, it's your responsibility to think about this test, whether you want to use it, whether you think reuse of the material is fair. The Copyright Office, we can provide you guidance and information, but since it's a legal test, and really it always comes down to a court deciding whether or not a use is fair, I can't tell you whether or not a use will be fair or not. That's something that you sort of have to think about, and whether you'd prefer to do permission, whether you prefer to use material on a fair dealing basis, etc. And because your thesis or practicum is available online worldwide through MSpace, it's advisable to err on the side of caution and really think about whether you think this test applies. Next slide, please. Then we have moral rights, and I've mentioned that these are the reputational rights of a creator. So if you're reusing someone's material, we need to think, are we making any modifications potentially that might in some way harm their reputation? And we think about that both subjectively, but also objectively. So it's a kind of a tricky, again, legal test. But I do notice when you ask to make modifications through something like Copyright Clearance Center, which I mentioned we can click and get to through our library access quite easily, usually it's a special request. Usually they send that back to the author or creator to say whether or not they agree with the modifications you'd like to make. So I bring this up because sometimes people will say to me, well, I'm not actually copying anything anybody used. I'm just, I'm taking their figure, but I'm modifying it. So that's okay, right? And I go, this is getting into a gray area. And it's a gray area because, are you just making a copy of what someone else has done and making changes, which might have moral rights implications? Or are you taking their ideas? So for example, if I see someone's figure and I go, I like these concepts, but I'm going to reconceptualize them a bit myself and change and do something new. If I've taken the ideas and made my own new figure, which is materially different, usually not a copyright issue, but I do need to give them credit. I need to say, where did I get those ideas from? Usually having a based on statement. But you really have to then consider, am I reproducing their figure and modifying it in a way that maybe they might have a problem with, or am I making something new and giving them credit for where I got the ideas from? So as I say, it can be a gray area, but it's something to think about when you are reproducing someone else's content. And I wonder, Andrea, if it's okay if I just quickly show the copyright course as well. Sorry, I don't know if that would be.
Yes, did you want me to stop sharing? You can share.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you. This should be it. So I just also wanted to bring to everyone's attention that we now have a new copyright course and tools. This is something that you won't automatically be registered in, but if you want access, contact me. I'm happy to get you in here. The copyright course, it does go through a lot of information for teaching purposes, but there's also content that's relevant to students and for your thesis. For example, our introductory section, Copyright in Canada and the University of Manitoba. It will give you a lot of just background information on copyright if you want to know more about these concepts, how they work, etc. And then we do have some streams of content, two being more geared towards teaching, but we have this middle one here. You'll see creator of copyright protected materials. So it explains more about how creators are protected by copyright law and more about managing your own copyright. So those are things that could be useful to you. We also have a copyright decision tool. Again, it's more geared towards teaching, but I think it's something that you might use and be able to say, okay, there is a copyright issue here. If you weren't sure, this might help you so you know whether or not there is. So just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention too. And I think with that, I can stop sharing and hand it back to you, Andrea.
Okay, so quickly before we proceed on to answering people's questions, I'm just gonna pick up a little bit on where Althea was talking about with regards to publishing decisions and permissions, and how this relates to thesis deposit. So we have so I provided the link here to on the MSpace information site, specifically in the depositing help FAQ, where we provide answers to commonly asked questions around publisher compliance, but everyone's circumstance is a little different. And publisher policy statements or responses from publishers can be confusing. So myself and Althea are happy to provide guidance if you're not sure or you get responses that you have a hard time interpreting. So in general, if there are excerpts of the thesis practicum that have been published, so this means at the time of deposit, you have what's called a sandwich thesis, or you have material on your research that you have published elsewhere. So for example, a journal article that you wish to have included in the body of your thesis, you need to understand what author rights you agreed to when you published that material. So hopefully you chose to publish in a what's called gold open journal publication, for example. Or if you published a book, it would be like diamond book or an open ebook type of thing. So what that means is that you have full rights to that material and that you can include it in your thesis without restriction because you retain all rights. So that means that if you publish with a commercial publisher, you can retain the formatting that the publisher applied to a final version of that article, for example, and that you do not need to apply an embargo. Okay, so that's a gold open, meaning you are able to and retain all rights to that material in that format. However, if you have chosen to go what's called a green publishing group with a commercial publisher, usually some rights are reserved on behalf of the publisher. So what does that mean? Usually it means that you do not have rights to include the final formatted version of that journal in your thesis. Or if you do, then the entire thesis needs to have some kind of embargo attached. So as I say, the embargo conditions are usually clearly laid out, but sometimes it's hard to interpret. So I'm happy to give guidance if you're not clear on what those conditions are. Accepted manuscript version. If you need to be in funding compliance, usually means post peer review, pre copy editing / final formatting processes have been applied to that version. Okay, so if you're not clear what version you are allowed or what is considered accepted manuscript version, you can either contact the publisher or again, I'm happy to sort of help you navigate that Sometimes it's really hard in the workflow of a publication. At what point is an accepted manuscript? Other publishers now, through their sort of rights management content systems, allow you to sort of log in as if you're the submitting author. You can get access to the accepted manuscript version. So happy to help you navigate that if you're at that point. For deposit, for green previously published publications. The embargo duration, as I sort of laid out in the walkthrough, so if it's 12 months from the point of publication of the article that was published with the commercial publisher, so it's usually 12 months plus 1 day. Sometimes the publisher stipulates that there must be textual language applied to the cover letter of the content with an active DOI link to the commercial publisher version of the content. So please, as always, as Althea has indicated, please read the permissions and be in compliance with those. And again, if you have any questions about that at any point, please ask myself or Althea. For future publishing intentions, okay, so this is when after your thesis deposit, we get a lot of questions around, can I publish my thesis in some other format, whether in whole or in part? And the answer, yes, of course, is of course. Because as Althea and I have clearly laid out, you retain all rights to that material. So the question then becomes, how do you negotiate your rights when you're considering publishing? Because oftentimes publishers will want to try and restrict those rights in favor of their own distribution considerations. And so that's where the tension comes in. So we really encourage you to think about publishing gold or diamond publishing options whenever possible. This means that this allows you to retain all rights in all ways. So you can redistribute, republish, reuse, whatever, all content on your thesis. However, if you are going to enter into a publisher that is not gold or diamond, please, please, please read the contractual understandings or any kinds of statements the publisher wishes you to sign off on. Sometimes the publishers are now asking authors to submit a statement of agreement with certain conditions. For example, I'm aware of one particular journal in the discipline of dentistry that had asked that if you had deposited this research in any type of repository, that essentially you were then to have to try and embargo or restrict that content, or you were essentially not going to be considered in that publication. So that's a problem, because if you've agreed to that, then the publisher can come back and essentially say, well, you said this, but you've in fact, have your thesis deposited in a repository. We will not permit retrospective embargoes. Publishers should not be restricting scholarship like this. So there's that condition, but then the other possible scenarios that we've encountered is you enter into a publication and then you come to sort of the green publication option, and then they're asking you to sort of embargo. Again, we really wish to not have to add restricted retrospective embargoes to theses. So please declare upfront. So see the asterisk. Whoops, I'm going to go back there a sec. Please declare to the publisher upfront that your thesis is publicly available in a repository and cannot be retracted or suppressed for a time period to favor the publisher contract. Okay. Happy to answer more questions about that if you have them. Again, just to repeat, these are the links that we strongly recommend that you look at. If you, in this presentation, realize that you need to request an embargo to your for your thesis, the Faculty Graduate Studies asks that you submit a form. So the link is on the form section of the Graduate Studies website. At this point, I am going to end this presentation and oh, here it is. There we go. All right. So I'm just going to start at the top and work my way down. If there are further questions in the chat, we'll just quickly have a look at the chat. So next question, does Research Manitoba count as a funder? Yes, it does. Again, filling out the funder section of the input form is not mandatory. You can certainly identify Research Manitoba as a funder if you wish. I'm going to be trying to create a quick list of sort of accompanying funder IDs for common funders. So if I'm happy to sort of look that one up and add them. But don't worry about it if you can't, if you don't know it. Next question. Thesis and practicum date is today's date you're positing, not the date of defense or something else. You can add the date of defense if you wish. I think most people pick the date of deposit, but it's as long as the date of defense is reasonably close to the graduation date, I think that's fine. If there's a discrepancy there, what I would suggest, or if there's a concern, I would recommend you talk to your student program assistant. Next question. Will uploading your thesis to MSpace restrict your ability to publish your work in a journal later? The answer is it should not. But if there are journals that you are interested in at the time that you're depositing or considering depositing your thesis, please come and talk to me or your liaison librarian, and we will help you make some informed decisions around where to publish. As I said in the presentation, you should always best practice to try and declare to the publisher upfront so that they can't say that they were informed that you do have this material already publicly available in a repository as a thesis. Also, I should say, theses is not a preprint, okay? And don't have a publisher tell you that it is, because it's not. Next question. If you have an embargo date that has already passed, do you still need to include it? No, you don't. So if you have material that you've previously published and included in your work, and the stipulation of embargo has already passed, then that means that that work should be now publicly available. And so therefore your thesis can include that as a reproduction, as an understanding of that. So the answer is no. If you're not quite clear about that, happy to, you can contact me and we're happy to have a look at it and let you know. Okay. Should you submit your thesis as a Word document or PDF? Do I need to deposit the thesis before defense date? Is the graduation date the same as the defense date? So there's a deadline, thesis deposit deadline for that precedes the graduation deadline as defined by Faculty of Graduate Studies. So the thesis, so for example, for all those graduating for October 2023, the thesis deposit deadline is August 24th, 2023. Okay. So the answer is it needs to at least be received and acknowledged by the student program assistant before the anticipated graduation date. If you have further questions about this, please contact your student program assistant. Okay. I am not a staff member of the Faculty of Graduate Studies, and so I don't wish to talk for them. So for all questions related to deadlines or workflows around sort of approval and those kinds of questions, please get to know your student program assistant. Okay. My question is regarding the initial step. I have my approval to proceed to PhD thesis examination signed by the supervisor, committee member, and department head. My question is, what is we need to submit the thesis to Faculty of Graduate Studies so that they could submit it to the external examiner. Should we submit that in MSpace because we're still waiting for the PhD examination? Please contact your student program assistant. They will be able to advise you as to whether or not you deposit, even just to have it sort of in the workflow to acknowledge that, or whether they will recommend that you hold off. Okay. If I want to upload a report as a scholarly work and obtain a Creative Commons license for it, should I submit it to MSpace and then Creative? No. Please, please obtain the Creative Commons license before you put it in MSpace. Okay, please. Depositing in an MSpace is a form of both preservation and distribution. Okay. The repository is a preservation tool. It provides active retention in perpetuity, but it also is distributing, and we distribute through many different sources and aggregators, including Library and Access Canada, Library Archives Canada, Google Scholar, Open Air, Explore, and many different aggregators. And so you will see, if you're so interested in the metrics for your thesis deposit, once you have done that, that people around the world do access it and read it and use it. And that's the whole point, right? That's why we do scholarship. Okay, so if you have questions around how to obtain that Creative Commons license, happy to meet with you and walk you through the Creative Commons tool. It is reasonably user-friendly, but sometimes you might have questions about, do I want this license or that license? And so, and navigating those can be somewhat confusing sometimes. So happy to walk and meet with you and discuss that if you have questions. Hi, after I submit my thesis, do I get any confirmation or email? Once you hit deposit, no, you do not get an email. You will get an email, however, once the student program assistant sort of looks at it and gives you sort of like either it's an approved to go on to the second stage. So there's a two-stage approval process. So the first stage is the student program assistant reviews it. If there are editing changes that need to be made, this provides both the student and the program assistant the ability to sort of work back and forth. Like, let's say you as the student have noticed typos in your thesis, or you have, for whatever reason, uploaded the wrong version of your thesis, or metadata is wrong, or something like that. You can ask your student program assistant to reject your submission, it returns back to your submission section of my MSpace. And then you can go back into it and make those changes, or, delete that version of the thesis, for example, upload a new one, those kinds of things. Once the student program assistant and the student decides, if there has been some back and forth, or if there hasn't been, and it meets the sort of the criteria for the first step, it gets approved, and there goes into sort of the second workflow. And by the second workflow, it's usually ready to be approved, and then the deposit essentially becomes final. We can make changes through your student program assistant. So if there, for whatever reason, needs to be final changes, usually the student program assistants contact me, and we, those of us in libraries that manage MSpace will make those changes. Two questions. While submitting my thesis, where can I add my co-supervisors? So in the input form of MSpace, there's the supervisor section. You can add more than one, so you'll see the little plus add more below it. So you can add more than one supervisor, okay? If you want, you can put in the chat. I can happy to bring it up, but for the sake of time, I'm going to try and avoid that if I can. But if you want me to show you, I can. I am currently awaiting the response of some journals regarding 2 of my not published papers, which are also 2 chapters of my PhD thesis. If I do not receive a response from the journals before the thesis submission deadline, I will have to submit my thesis in its current form. Is it possible for me to utilize the embargo option and subsequently submit an updated version of my thesis once the papers is published? So I guess what I would say is, if I would encourage you to reach out to me and make an appointment with me, sort of independently, because this would be a particular, like, I would need to know what journals you submitted to and what were the conditions of the submission, like where are you at. If you're before the approval or acceptance point, you have probably have options. If you are past that point, i.e. you have accepted with whatever conditions you agreed to, then that changes the scenario, okay? So I would need to know the journal, and I would need to know where you're at in the submission process. It could be, unfortunately, that maybe you don't get accepted, and so that changes things again, right? Because then you're submitting to something else, and so the choices then potentially become bigger, depending on, or more, or different. And so those all are things that kind of change my answer, I guess. And so please contact me. I'm happy to meet with you and sort of discuss those things. So in terms of the timing of this particular question, yes, you will have to submit your thesis in its current form. And in terms of utilizing the embargo, I mean, it's possible. You could submit an embargo option. I would caution you against that, depending on where you're at in the manuscript submission process, just because, let's say, for example, you have approved, you're in the acceptance stage, and you pick a publishing option that then applies further embargo, like the actual embargo stipulation, and then you have not accounted for that in your first embargo request. As you will see in our MSpace policy, and as identified by the Faculty of Graduate Studies, we do not permit extended embargo. We're really trying to not have material embargoed forever. And so that's where I kind of caution you about applying a sort of a preemptive embargo, because then you will probably have to then have the embargo extended, and then that you every single time you ask for an extension, you have to essentially go through the faculty graduate studies. So better to, if you haven't got to the acceptance point, you still have options, and so happy to discuss them with you. So this is kind of a very complicated kind of question that really requires sort of more of a consultation. But I hope I sort of outlined why it's complicated and why it would be important to consult. Okay, so we're at 11:26. Someone started to ask a question. So we have a few more minutes if there's any further questions. How can you access this MS Word file? I'm just going to put in my, I'm going to put me and Althea's email address in the chat just so that you have it, so that you can email Althea and I. If you wish to make an email request for a consultation. Examining committee members is the same as committee members. Yes, yes, it is. Yes. Next. How can I access this Word file? I'm planning to put both the questions that were asked here in the commonly asked questions. I'm just going to actually jump to the MSpace page in case you haven't seen it. It's this one. So this link is in the list of links that we provided in the presentation deck. So we will put the frequently asked questions Word document here. We'll nicely format it so that it's a little more readable. But I'll also put them in the frequently asked questions section of our help site. We will also put a link to this video and presentation deck here, so it's accessible. All the steps that I sort of walked through in our live demo are outlined here in sort of a text way. So I hope it's understandable. Always happy to receive feedback if there's a clear way to put things. Here's all the steps in terms of how to upload material, and so I attempted to show you all the different ways to do that. And then here are the step-wise instructions and guidance on how to fill out the input form. New messages. Right. Scrolling down here. Does your thesis need to be approved by the program assistant before the deadline, or just uploaded to MSpace? If you're not clear about how how your thesis looks before you upload, please consult your student program assistant. But as a general rule, what they ask is that you upload your thesis and hit deposit. It goes into their workflow, and essentially what they do is check the box, and then they generally start reviewing the theses, as I understand it, after the deadline, but that's not necessarily the case. They tend to do it before the deadline too, but they just want to make sure that if you have to meet the deadline, that you're there, and then they just make sure that everybody's there, because if you're not there, then they're going to start like chasing you down. You want to make sure that if you have to meet the deadline, that you're at least there so that they can check you off. Pertaining to Essen's question, does your external committee member count as a committee member? Yes. After we deposit the thesis, how long will it take to appear in MSpace? It really depends on the student program assistance workflow. There's a lot of people. It's a lot of work. depending on how prepared you are with your thesis and uploading and all that, it may be fast for them, or if people require more back and forth, it might be slower. So, all right, that takes us to 11:30. I'm going to stop recording, and thank you all very much for attending.